Hi, and welcome back to this Tuesday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point. The network is AFR Talk, the American Family Radio Talk Network. Just speaking, I'm going to go back to the Connecticut shooting, but just kind of some back stop stuff there. I was gratified to see that James Dobson came out yesterday, adding his voice to my voice and Governor Huckabee's, that what we're dealing with here is a moral decline, and the protection that we have enjoyed from the moral capital that we have built up by trusting God, depending upon God to protect us, protect our families, protect our children, that protection is eroded because we haven't rebuilt that. We've let that protective cover, we've let it erode, and now that shield, that shelter is virtually gone. And here's a piece by David Brody of the Brody File. He's the chief political correspondent for CBN News, and he posted this on the Brody File yesterday. Mike Huckabee says school shootings happen because, quote, God is absent from our schools, end quote. Then after he has the embedded clip of Governor Huckabee speaking on Neil Cavuto's program on Fox News, he then adds this: Brian Fisher from the American Family Association believes the same thing. And then he has embedded a clip from my program of last week. And he's responded to the fact that we were vilified and demonized for what we said. James Dobson came out yesterday morning on his program. You heard it right here on the American Family Radio Talk Network, saying once again, we are reaping what we have sown by the fact we have turned our back on God for decades now. And here's what Brody says in my defense and Mike Huckabee's defense. Guess what, folks? Huckabee and Fisher are not alone. There are millions of evangelicals who believe the same thing. This is not heartless. It's based on the biblical principle of reaping and sowing. Not that these little children sowed anything, but are our schools left unprotected because of the past actions of our nation when it comes to removing God from our public schools. The conversation is now all about banning guns, but should the conversation really be about allowing God back into the public schools? Food for thought, he says. It's a discussion worth having. And speaking of that discussion, and Rob, let's hold that clip just for a minute. I talked with you yesterday about, and my column up at rightlyconcerned.com was on this topic of when God withdraws, when his hand of protection, when his hand of favor, when his hand of blessing, when his hand of shielding and protection is withdrawn. Now, he does that reluctantly. He only does it if we drive him from our presence by our obstinate disobedience, by our refusal to acknowledge him, our refusal to call on his name, to call on him for protection. You know, and I was reminded of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. And before I get into that, just let me remind, you know, I've often said that the best security for a school as well as for a home is God and a loaded gun. I mean, this is what Nehemiah said. This is a biblical principle. Nehemiah 4:9, they're rebuilding the walls. The walls are broken down. The gates are burned with fire. Nehemiah says, we've got to rebuild here, and every man put a shoulder to the task. And what Nehemiah said in Nehemiah 4:9, we prayed and set a guard, not one or the other. We prayed and we set a guard. So it's not, we don't just depend upon God, because one of the things, if we depend upon God, then we do what God says. And what does God say? Well, God says set a guard. So if we're going to obey God, if we're going to trust God, that means we do what he says. And he says, well, you need to set a guard. It's not just a matter of prayer. It's a matter of prayer and setting a guard. It's God and a loaded weapon, a loaded gun. And that's because God does not protect us apart from our cooperation, apart from our collaboration. We are co-laborers with God in protecting our families and protecting our children. There are things that will not happen unless we do our part. God says, look, this is the way this thing works. I've got a role in this, and I've entrusted to you a role in providing protection. If you don't do your part, which is to pray and set a guard, if you're not going to do your part, that's your part, is to pray and set a guard. You don't do that, there are no guarantees that you're going to be able to enjoy protection. You're leaving yourselves vulnerable if you do that, because we work together. God says, look, I've given you a free will. I've given you instructions. I've given you a brain. I've given you the Second Amendment. I've given you weapons, and I'm expecting you to use them. This is your part in providing protection. I've got a role. You have a role in this. And if you don't do your part, you're not going to be able to count on the kind of protection you otherwise would be able to enjoy. And I was reminded of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. They got to loggerheads in 1787. I mean, they were ready to break apart. Everybody was ready to go home. They were bickering with each other. It was hot. They were agitated with each other. And a lot of the delegates actually were thinking about packing it in and going home that night, and the entire Constitutional Convention would have collapsed, and there would be no United States of America. And so Ben Franklin at that point got up. And remember, Ben Franklin's the guy that's considered the least religious of all the founders. Everybody says about Ben Franklin that he was a deist. Not true, and I'll prove it here in just a second. But Benjamin Franklin gets up and delivers this impassioned appeal to the founders to bring prayer back into the halls of government. He says, look, this is the problem. We've been deliberating, we have been debating, we have been arguing, we have been discussing, but we have not asked for the help of God. That's why we're about ready to run a reef. We're about ready to run into the rocks and break up on the rocks. And he says this is part of his speech. How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? And then he reminded the delegates that when they were involved in their contest with Britain, that they had daily prayer every day in the very same room in which they were meeting. Said, in this room, we had daily prayer during the contest with Britain for, these are Ben Franklin's words, for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. And he says, because we prayed every single day in this room, every day we sought God for protection, we observed, these are again Ben Franklin's word, this is supposed to be Mr. Deist, Mr. God is a clockmaker guy that winds it up and then leaves the scene and lets things happen without any attention, without any involvement, without any engagement. That's what everybody thinks Ben Franklin was. He wasn't that way at all. Ben Franklin says, because we prayed every day and we sought divine protection, we, quote, observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. So he says, look, this is one of our founding fathers. When we were involved with Britain, we prayed every single solitary day, and we were asking God for what? We were asking God for divine protection. What do our schools need? What do our school children need? They need divine protection. Ben Franklin says, how do you get it? You ask God for it every single solitary day. As elected officials, as politicians, as statesmen, you ask God every day for his divine protection. And then you get about doing the business that God has assigned to you to do. And he says, look, this is the problem, Ben Franklin says. We have now forgotten that powerful friend. Ben Franklin says, you know why we're about ready to run on the rocks here? Because we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the powerful friend who provided us with so many observed instances of a superintending providence in our contest with Britain. And he says, do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? He says, are we so arrogant and so full of pride that we think that now that that war is over, that we no longer need the help and the assistance of God? And then this is Ben Franklin, Mr. Deist, Mr. God's not involved in human life. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. Now, no deist, no self-respecting deist would ever say that. God doesn't govern in the affairs of men. He's not involved. He's remote. He's detached. He's off somewhere in his office in heaven, not paying any attention to what goes on here on earth. That was not Ben Franklin's worldview. God governs in the affairs of men. He understood that God is an active participant in political matters. And he added this: if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? He says, look, God's a God of compassion. He sees everything. He knows everything. A sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice. Do we have the arrogance to think that we can build an empire without his assistance, without his aid? Do we have the arrogance as a culture, do we have the arrogance as a people to think that our children can be protected from harm without imploring God for his divine protection? And so consequently, Ben Franklin moved that day that prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. And what happened as a follow-up to this is they had a joint service the following Sunday. They adjourned. The next time they met was for a church service. They all went to church on Sunday. This is around July 4, around the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. They all went to church together, and there was something magical, and I use that in a metaphoric sense, something magical, meaning something supernatural happened to the atmosphere. The tension broke. The contention vanished. They were able to find a solution to the problem that just about destroyed the convention. They began having prayers every single day before they proceeded to business. That's when the practice of having House and Senate chaplains began, and it's continued ever since. There's never been a session of Congress that has not opened without a chaplain or someone asking for the assistance of God. And ladies and gentlemen, if Congress can do it, schools can do it. Listen to me. If Congress can have a chaplain that prays publicly in front of everybody for God's assistance every single day, schools can do the same thing. They can have a chaplain who prays over the PA system every single day for God's protection. Focal Point AFR Talk.